There we go. Shabbat Shalom, everyone who is on YouTube. Um, I am excited again to join you guys. And, I've thought a lot about the fact that I have a YouTube channel. And I've thought a lot about my journey, and I've thought a lot about the kind of the humbling space that I'm in at the moment. There's a relative amount of feeling of unworthiness, like I really don't belong here or whatever. Obviously, if you watch my Renewing the Mind series, you know that I'm right in the thick of those learning experiences. But this parasha is an interesting parasha, and uh, the the premise here is that since the camera for the scroll broke, that I know that we are not going to necessarily be discussing the parasha. But what's interesting is every now and then there's an anomaly to whatever pattern it is that God is working with us. This one is a very interesting one. This is kind of a little bit complex, and so it's going to probably be a longer message because I have to break stuff way, way, way down. Okay. But let's go with the premise of the cycle of Israel, right? But we're also going to go with the premise that there's an anomaly in speech here. Okay. So we're going to touch on the parasha just a smidge, but not much. And the reason why that's important is because this message right here. So for those of you who are familiar with the time management matrix, you may know that there is a important section and an unimportant section, and there is an urgent section and an unurgent section, and then there's an important and urgent section. In fact, it almost behooves me to draw this on the board per se. So let's go ahead and let's jump over to the whiteboard for a moment. So jumping into the whiteboard, what we have here is basically this grid, right? And basically I have like on this side urgent, and then unurgent. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and draw this grid like this. And up here we have important and unimportant. Now, when we deal with these breakdowns, we're dealing with the level of value, right? So value plays a role here. And we're dealing with the level of insistence. Okay. So the reason why I'm drawing this on the board, it really has actually nothing to do with the message, but just to give you an absolute, let's change it to neon green, absolute exhortation, warning. No, what's the word I'm thinking of? An absolute yeah, pay attention. I don't know how else to say it. This is very important and very, very urgent. Now, I am not a Signs of the Times person at all, but that's how you need to think about this message. It has insistence and it has high value. Okay. Does that mean, pay attention, blah, blah, blah? Yeah, sure. But there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. There's a sense of urgency within me concerning this message, and there's a persistence of it asserting itself over and over and over this week, and me not having a clue what was actually going on. Like, I was like, I don't get it. I don't understand. Why is this so insistent? And yet here we are. Um, I'm one of those people who's like, "Oh, Lord, if you're gonna whoop me, you know. But if there's another plan, then you need to show it to me, right?" Well, that was just wasn't happening. But the premise is that in my brain, this was processing as urgent and important. Now, I do not prepare my messages. The reason I don't is because I believe that I can get in the way if I do that. If I sit down and I start writing down keynotes or studying out words, etc., then there's a problem. Well, there was a number. Okay, so just so you know, when you begin to open your heart to and be willing to listen to the coincidences, because remember, there are no coincidences. That is the divine trying to communicate with you. Friend calls after 20 years of not seeing them. Pay attention, right? You have this person bring up a subject and this person bring up a subject, and it's the same subject, and there's no way they've talked to each other. They might even be enemies, right? There is an element of synchronicity going on, and it started at the beginning of the week on Sunday as I was relaxing, and there was some persistence. So like during the week, I saw one of my friends who's homeless, etc. And so as I've began to understand this whole mechanism, I've began to understand that there is a lot more going on than what we can appreciate. Well, for whatever reason, this morning, it became clear in a way that I have never had it be confirmed before, which was basically where God told me a phrase, stated a phrase to me, and then all of a sudden I figured out that that was actually two different verses of the Bible. So God was communicating with me on the Remez level. So let's start at the very beginning. There's some foundations that we need to build. The first thing that is uber important is the fact that when Moses created the scroll, he put breaks in the scroll, not chapter and verse breaks, just breaks. Okay. And those breaks are called parshiot. And so there are two types of parshiot. There is what's called the parasha stuma, and there is the parasha petuach. The parasha petuach is an open. So the break in the scroll is to the side of the margin, and then the stumach is in between. Now, let me show you this in the scroll, or I mean in the text in the Westminster Leningrad Codex for this week's parasha, and that is going to be starting in chapter 10 of Exodus. We'll go ahead and jump down there. Okay. But what I want to do is I'm going to do a side-by-side of the Westminster Leningrad Codex. So on the one side, we have the NLT, and on the other side, we have this going on. You see these breaks? These breaks are not necessarily the breaks that I'm talking about. So in general, when a new chapter starts, obviously, you won't necessarily see it. But let me see if it is present in our text here. Yeah, see the pay right here? That's a pituach break in the scroll. Okay, that means that the break happens to the edge of the margin and not in the center of the text. Here is a stumach break right here. I may be pronouncing those inappropriately, but you get my point. Moshe is the one who put the breaks in the scroll. Well, eventually Ezra comes along and he puts he looks at these breaks, and his thought was that he wanted the Torah to be read in the marketplace. Why the marketplace? I've always asked that question to myself. Why was it the marketplace where it was read? Right? Well, obviously, could we just go with the literal here, that that's the most communal gathering area, right? In the land of this dilapidated, destroyed Israel. They're rebuilding, they're trying to rebuild the temple, they're trying to reestablish government. But the idea of the merchants coming in and there being a connection of the people to these traders and to these shops, et cetera, et cetera. He wanted the Torah to be read aloud in the marketplace, to be heard, right? To be cried out. So basically, as Moses puts these breaks, now Ezra comes along and says, I want a 7-day reading of an equal division of Torah portions. So he comes up with this, 54 section, the 54 sections of this Torah scroll, which is in our thought process, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But in his thought process, that's not how it worked. There were no book breaks per se. Okay. And so as a result of that, then what we have is we have all of these parashas having a very specific keyword attached to them. Now, the relevance is going to become apparent as we look at this week's parasha, but the premise that, and this is important, the premise here is the idea that there is a sentiment with Ezra to have the Torah read over a 7-day period. Well, in a modern day Chumash, you have that. You have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. Okay. And so the premise is that over that 6-day period, you would have it read. And on the 7th day would be the last section. And that last section then would be that 7th day, last section would be taught upon, so to speak. All right. Of course, this is confirmed in Acts chapter 15, verse 21, where it says, for Moses is preached from ancient times. What's ancient times? Ezra, right? In the synagogue on the Sabbath. In other words, what he was saying was, yeah, we need the Gentiles to refrain from these very specific things because they create positional curse, which someday you'll learn about positional curse, but not today necessarily. They create positional curse, but the premise is that those ones we will have them not do. We'll have them follow the laws of the Noahide, right? Until they go into the synagogue and learn Torah, right? Because they have to study through Torah for a year before they could actually convert to Judaism. And that was the premise that James was working with. He was very zealous for the Jews. Okay. Now, so the reason why all of this is relevant is because then we understand that these specific key words that name these sections were not broken up by Moses to be read on specific Sabbaths. That was a very new thing that occurred where Ezra had basically cut the Torah up into these portions and started with a parasha, right? And that specific parasha then was a whole set of parashas that was a section to be read. Now, I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but the premise is that basically what we have then is we have the sentiment that there is an actual intention from God to have us have very specific sections at very specific times. It is no coincidence that we are in the pagan month of Janus. And that is usually when these Torah sections fall. Okay. When I say there's no coincidence, what I mean is that as the pagan months became the calendar, January, February, March, April, May, we are now stepping into a moment when we are supposed to be focusing on Passover. So those of you who have rejected Torah and said, oh, it has been done away with, the beginning of months for you is this time of worshiping the God of Janus by making resolutions. That's right. A New Year's resolution is how you worship a false god. So then the premise is that then when you should be focusing on one of the most important feast days that is present in your faith, you are probably most likely thinking in your mind it's the first of the year, tax time, et cetera, et cetera. When I talk about the necessity of imperativeness, you will understand that there's a necessity to refocus your brain now. And there's some reasons behind it. Okay. So the first most important thing that we need to do then is we need to take a look at this anomaly in Torah. So what do we know about this Torah portion? This Torah portion is going to predicate the wilderness season, and we will talk about that in a minute. So one of the things that we need to remember is that what we have learned and discovered is how the wilderness season activates within a human being. You say, well, what's the wilderness season? I will explain in a second. But the first thing we need to do is realize that the Father is trying to get our attention here. And it probably even confused Moses. So in order to understand that, we're going to go over here. And like I said, we don't, since the camera broke for the scroll, until we have the funds to get a new one, we're not preaching from the parasha. But this one specifically, for whatever reason, is sticking out. Okay. And so in our parasha, it says, and the Lord says, return to Pharaoh, return. Okay. It is often that we will encounter the NLT, those scholars working so hard to interpret the idiomatic principle of a phrase. Okay. Let me show you what I mean. So in the NASB, it says go to Pharaoh, right? In the King James, it says go. Even Mr. Young, who I consider to be one of the most foremost scholars on Hebrew, says go. Now, here's the part that's important. In the idiomatic understanding, in fact, let's take a moment and talk about this. In the idiomatic understanding of the tent, there is a function of what we call going in and coming out. Okay. So the way that we are going to kind of work through this is we're going to work from the premise of what it means to go out and come in. Okay. So let's jump over to our whiteboard again. Okay. And we're going to work with this thought process. So let's first start Let's see. I think I want this to be yellow. Okay, so let's first start with this tent, right? So we have the door here, which we know is also a wall that separates the outside from the inside. On the inside of the tent, and let's do that actually in the bright green. On the inside of the tent, okay, we have what? Well, that was definitely not what I was trying to do here. We have what? We have this premise, right, of provision, protection, and instruction. That's coming from the tent. That's coming from the mother and the father, or the ima, or the abba, okay, which is the masculine and feminine principle. Let's not quite go there yet. All right. So now what we have is I'm going to do bright green is to go out. Actually, you know what? Let me change this. There's a reason I'm going to do it this way, is because, yeah, we can use blue actually. Okay, so here's the premise. You're going out of the tent, right? Out. This is the idea of going out with intention, right? Because what's outside the tent? Nakedness, shame, exposure, unless you're going out there to tame the field. Remember, Yeshua said the field is the world. You're going out to tame the field, or you're going out to tame the animals. Who are the animals? Those with weak minds, right? Going out to tame them, right? But the premise is that as you go out the tent, this is the going out. Okay? So the going out of the tent is kind of the concept of going out with intention. This is not the bad going out. This isn't being cast into outer darkness per se, as it is going out to do something that is responsible, right? So you're leaving the provision, protection, and instruction for the sake of taming. Okay, that's why you go out. And then there is the sentiment that you what? That you go in to the tent, and not as a result of teshuvah, but as a result, and when I say teshuvah, not as a result of repentance. You're not returning to the tent because you have been outside in exposure and shame. You're returning to the tent because of that fact right there, okay? That you went out to tame, okay? Now, the premise is that as you go out to tame, there is a need to go and return and come in. That is the Hebrew word bo, to go in. In fact, the word for if you are in a relationship and there is intercourse, that is bo, to go in to the vessel of reception. Okay? So bo actually doesn't mean go. It means to come. All right? And this is very, very, very important. I'm going to write this in red. It means to come, as in to go into, right? As in there's somebody here waiting for you in the tent, so to speak, right? Okay. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is coming in and going out, does not have to do with shame, does not have to do with sin, does not have to do with repentance, it does not have to do with crying out, none of that stuff. This has to do with a very mature human being with a strong mind going out to tame the outside, right? Or coming towards the tent, returning with anticipation. In fact, bow in its ancient pictographic actually means empty, as in desire. Okay? Okay. Now, there's a few reasons why that is important. Number one, it is important because God is telling Pharaoh or telling Moses, come to Pharaoh. Now, there's a couple ways that I think about this. I think that maybe God is with Pharaoh at this moment and tells Moses to come, or he said this to Moses and Moses was like, okay, I'm kind of confused. And God was like, that way. Right? Like Moses is like, wait a minute, you didn't say go to him. You definitely said come. In fact, the rabbis actually discuss this in a few different Jewish literatures where they say, why does it say come? It's supposed to say go to Pharaoh, right? Okay, let's leave all that alone for the most part and just say that this parasha is asking you, at the very least, by creating an anomaly, to pay attention. Pay very important attention. Now, what do we have? What do we know? Well, first of all, what is in Bo? What is in the actual parasha Bo? Well, it's the death of the firstborn. It's the Passover. It's that moment when they go from what? Hundreds of years of what? Intense, labored service to Pharaoh to not being under his authority anymore. So what is Bo? Bo is a status change, an absolute status change. From what? Well, let's go with the simplicity of English words. Slave to free. Okay, that's not what it says in the Hebrew. Not even close. But let's keep it simple. Slave to free, status change. Okay. Now, in that status change, something interesting is happening. And that is that in that status change, there is a change in the mentality, or there should have been. And that was one of what? Of scarcity versus abundance. Now we're going to get into this in a minute. But the premise is that scarcity versus abundance is a mentality in which a slave, what? Has a scarcity mentality and believes that they need to what? They need to hoard. They need to keep and prevent from they don't share, right? They don't share. It's every man for himself. It's the idea of what is mine. I'm not sharing because there's not enough. And it's a very real thing in a slavery process. Why? Because there is a minimal intention from the master to have the slave eat at the equal level of his table. There's a minimum provision, okay? So we fast forward into the Torah, and what do we have? Oh, that we were back in Egypt where we had the flesh pots and the onions and the leeks and the garlic. And now all we have is this manna to eat, right? For so long, I've thought to myself, they are so ungrateful. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to start to look at this seasonal connection, this cosmic connection to the Passover, the time period in which we are in right now, and the pagan influence upon it, and the other things that are involved. Okay? So the way that we're going to do that is we are going to start by illustrating something on the board. So first of all, when we are dealing with the thought process here of abundance versus scarcity, we need to think in terms of an ebb and flow in economic status. Okay. But what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and start. We'll start with drawing our cycle of Israel. So what do we know? We know that there are points and that they correspond to the promise from the rainbow, right? Remember the rainbow? So what's the rainbow say? The rainbow says that we would have cold and heat. So let's do our cold. This is winter, right? Winter. And we have spring, because that just is obviously the next season. And then we have summer, right? And then we have fall. Okay. And so in general, we know that during this time there is a death that occurs, right? And we know that that has to do with, let's just go ahead and put it here, burial, right? Because things fall to the ground and die. The seed is thrown into the ground and it dies. And then, of course, our next level, we have what? Resurrection, which of course corresponds to what? That corresponds to the principle of a cycle, that there isn't actually a time of death, okay, but instead a time of resting or waiting, right? And then in that sentiment, there is kind of sort of like a going out or a shooting forth, right? Then in summer, we have what? We have maturation. Maturation, where it's not as hard to understand the things that were hard to understand here. Okay. But then in fall, we have what? Entropy. Things start breaking down, right? Now, in the cycle of Israel, we understand that this is a marked point. I put it in a different color. This is a marked point of what? This is going to be complacency, right? Which is it is connected with maturation in the sense that hungry people do not go after other gods. Hungry people know where their provision comes from, so to speak, right? Okay. But the premise is that as that occurs, then we have what? Then we have, and we'll put this one in red, then we have infestation, in which there is a invitation from the pagan nations to participate in their holidays to worship their gods, who are not gods, but are instead demons. And that's going to become important in a minute. But every single time, and you can find this in the book of Judges, that there's an infestation, which happens with an invitation. So we'll just put that here. Invitation to join. Come with us and worship other gods, right? And then what happens? The next thing that happens is there's a moment when there is a breakdown in what? In the authority of Israel. And that becomes what? Occupation, or better yet, oppression. Okay? Oppression is where we go from infestation, where, hey, come worship our gods, we will have peace with each other, to we're going to start making rules and laws about things, and that is eventually going to cause you are either going to do what we say, or we're going to make war with you. And of course, as they make war with them, then we enter into possession. And we are dealing with possession. We are dealing with that nation who worships another god and is under the control of a what? Demon. Right? Under the control of a demon. And when we are dealing with that thought process of being under the control of a demon, then there's a moment when there is what? A crying out. And then what? The Yeshua, you guys know this by now. Let's go ahead and let's put that in purple, because that is very important action that occurs. The Yeshua principle is activated. What is the Yeshua principle? Remember that is what? Let's go ahead and go back to pink for this one. That is destroyer watches. Okay. In which point in time between this point here and this point here, let's go back to purple. There is, back to purple here. I did. Okay. There is a time, and we'll label this from here, deliverance. And in that deliverance, there is Israel army, led by the judges, right? Led by Deborah, led by Barak, led by Samson, led by Gideon, etc. During that time of deliverance, between this time of crying out and this time of the Yeshua principle activating and deliverance occurring, there is what we would call feigned obedience. Let's call it that. Feigned obedience. Now, why is that important? Because it's a fake it till you make it. You can't be obedient yet because you have not been delivered from the authority here until this point, which is where death begins, right? And so the premise is that in this section right here, you are basically going through a transition in status from being possessed, or owned is a better word than possession, because we have this issue in Christianity where we have the nerve to think that we are some sort of avatar that can be animated by some spiritual being. Okay. And the premise is that if there's any animation that occurs, it is our own. It doesn't necessarily mean that demons aren't going to show you things and make you capable of things. That is very real. But the idea of there's an actual animation as a result of some sort of supernatural enhancement of the body because there's something dwelling within you is off in its understanding. Now, I know that there is that statement by Yeshua of come out of him, and that kind of gives us, unfortunately, a very inappropriate perception because we don't understand the idiomatic elements there. But this is what I need you to understand. I need you to understand that between this point here and this point here, you are in a state of feigned obedience, okay? Which is basically the crying out moment when, okay, I need your help and I will not do this anymore, right? Because what is going to happen? In order for you to have become fully repentant, you have to be tempted again in this process of infestation. We'll get back to that. So this is supposed to be, this time of entropy is supposed to be a breaking down of the authority of demons, not the breaking down of the authority of Israel. This point is supposed to be all about us going out and taming the animals and the crops, right? Instead, we become tamed. Okay. So when we are talking about the wilderness season, it is important to understand that that is a time period in which there is a lack of abundance, all right, in the physical, but an extraordinary amount of abundance in the spiritual. Now, we're going to get to this. So now, if we were to take this point right here, which is the crying out, and we were to graph it on a line, as it goes around the circle, the way that it looks as it's going around the circle, if you were to take and stand sideways and face it, would look something like this. Okay? So the thought process that you need to get your mind wrapped around here is that this is an ebb and flow as a result of behavior, yes, but also there's a what should be versus what is not, and there is what is which shouldn't be. Okay? All right. Now, let's move to this next spot. So in this whole idea, then what we have is we have this operation. Let's see, let me talk about this for a minute. So there are 3 feasts in which they are mandatory pilgrimages commanded by God, and all 3 of those feasts have in some way been augmented or forgotten by Christianity as a result of the antinomian and the anti-Semitism the antinomianism and the anti-Semitism present in the pagan church. What do I mean by pagan? I mean that when pagans started coming in and influencing this assembly of people who claim to be Christ's church, there is a removal of Passover, a removal of Feast of Tabernacles, and a forgetting of Pentecost. So if I write up on the board here, Pentecost. Actually, no. Let's start with Passover. So if I write up, and I'm going to put these in royal color, I think, for illustration purposes. So this is going to be Passover. Okay. Then we have Pentecost. And we have Tabernacles. Then we have this sentiment of what? We have this idea that each one of these is what? Harvest. A reaping. We are told during these seasons, we are not allowed to have poor present with us, because what we need to do is we need to elevate them. Okay. So now, as we're going from Passover to Pentecost, there is a reduction in prosperity. This is called the wilderness season. Right? There's a reduction in prosperity with this point right here of what? Of a crying out, but for a very different reason. Oh, that God would have let us die in Egypt. He brought us out here into the wilderness to die. And then from Pentecost into Tabernacles, there is an increase in abundance, right? Which is what? This is the golden calf season. And so when we're talking about an ebb and flow, one of the ways that we can look at this as the sentiment that this is the beginning of a death, as it were, right? Starting with what? What did Passover start with? Let's change this color here just to maintain some really good mnemonic coloring. If I use more colors, you remember more. That's the premise. Okay, so Passover is what? The crying out. Or actually, so let's do it this way. Let's actually go before then on the timeline. Let's put it here. And in fact, let me go ahead and I will draw the timeline in. And we will go ahead and use that color right there. And we'll draw the timeline in here. Okay. And so the principle is that this time before is the crying out, in which there is this strong deliverance of Passover, in which there's what? There is the death of the firstborn as a result of there being no blood on the doorpost. Both Egyptian and Israelite lost firstborns because everybody was warned to do this action of putting blood on the doorpost, which was at the very simplest point, an act of obedience. Okay. But now there is something important happening. And that is what is happening in the supernatural realm. The realm right outside your realm of sight is doing this number. There's a counter wave going on here. And what? They're harmonizing? No, they're canceling each other out in their own way. The physical ailment of scarcity is resulting in a distraction from the peak of spiritual enlightenment. Now, why is this important? Because what is actually occurring at the Passover? The choosing. Of the bride. What's happening at Pentecost? The betrothal of the bride. And what's happening at Tabernacles? The consummation. The going in. The going in. And so at Passover, we go out. At Pentecost, we have an understanding that there is a time of rest or waiting, but not necessarily in the tent. And then at Tabernacles, we go in. Okay. All right. So here's the part that's important. As abundance occurs, it is a distraction from what? From the spiritual decline that's occurring. Remember, Pentecost begins a spiritual decline, right? That only returns and corrects itself at Tabernacles. Remember, Passover begins a spiritual incline that corrects itself for the balance sake at Pentecost. Okay? And so the sentiment here is that as things start to get better, things are actually getting worse. As things start to get really better, things are getting really bad. And so if we take and let me do this one in that color, there is a decline in spiritual energy, in spiritual authority, etc. And there is an actual incline. And let's do this in red because it's actually not necessarily good. Oops. Do this in red. It is not necessarily good. There is an incline in abundance. Now, there is a reason why that is important, because obviously Pentecost has this big old intersection. Yes, of course. But there's something else as well. You need to remember this ebb and flow is actually the cycle of Israel. Okay? And so there's this crying out, and then an army of Israel delivers itself from Egypt. Why do I say that? Because what did they do? They left as an army. Remember, and this is important, remember, 602, I believe it is, men of war on foot. Okay? Important. And so this army delivers itself, as is the cycle of Israel, and there is this process that's occurring. What's interesting about this is this also corresponds to spring, right? This corresponds to summer, and this corresponds to fall. And notice, winter is not included in the feast day cycle. But what you need to know is that the Passover season actually begins in winter physically, in the sense that what? Bo happens in January, which is the winter months per se. Now, that's for a Western Hemisphere process, right? But we're speaking more philosophically here. And what I mean by that is that the Passover season begins with the reading of the parasha, not the moment when we eat Passover. So if we look at this as being that moment when we read Bo, then there should be a sentiment of crying out as a result of what? There having had been this possession. Now, where this can get confusing is obviously because if I say that that's going on, then obviously this is winter time and Passover is in the spring. Then there's a understanding that there's a resurrection at Passover. Well, that's a no-brainer. That's when Yeshua rose from the dead, right? And on the Feast of First Fruits. But the sentiment is then that the betrothal will always happen after the maturation. Okay, now all of that I just showed you is a recap. And it's a recap because I need it fresh in your mind for what we are going to talk about next, which is basically what happens to the abundance or what's supposed to happen to the abundance. Okay. All right. So first of all, remember they're leaving Egypt extremely wealthy. Remember, they got and they went and they asked for gold and clothing, and they plundered Egypt. It was as if they had gone to war with Egypt and had ransacked the place and taken spoils of war. Okay. But now they head off into the wilderness season. What do I mean by wilderness season? Well, there was a season, there was a time period appointed by God in which they were what? They were moving away from the seven palms, away from the oasis, into the desert, heading towards Mount Sinai. At around the 50th day, they arrive at Mount Sinai, meaning what? Pentecost. The 50th day after the Passover, they arrive at Mount Sinai. Why is this important? Because that wilderness season in between is indicated in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Let's go there now. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, we have this going on in verse 3. And we will get out of we'll get rid of the Westminster Leningrad Codex, and we will move it to the NLT. Remember how the Lord God led you through the wilderness these 40 years, in verse 2, sorry. For these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands, right? But look at this. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to you and your ancestors. He did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone, rather we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Okay, now I'm not going to deal with the clothes or any of that other stuff. The wilderness season was designed to what? To humble them. Okay? To humble them. And in that process of humbling, they would what? Go hungry so that they would what? They would curse their God. You say, why would Yahweh give them an instance in which they curse their God? Well, let's talk a minute about the wilderness season. They have just come out of Egypt. What does Moses say to Pharaoh? Moses says to Pharaoh, we need to take our flocks and our herds that we may go 3 days into the wilderness and what? And sacrifice to our God, right? Of course, in that sentiment, Pharaoh's like, yeah, no, the men can go. but let the children and the women stay, or let the livestock stay, right? He keeps trying to create conditions or limitations on what they can or can't do. But when they leave with their livestock. Okay. Now, I don't know about y'all, but there is a point where we start to realize they had food right in front of them. They could have eaten the cattle. They could have eaten the flocks, right? They could have eaten this livestock that they brought out from Egypt. Recall that we've actually had a sermon about this, right? Where it didn't make sense unless you factor in the idea that it was a livelihood, that it was actually assets, that it was actually part of their abundance. But they refused to consume it and then complained to God about it. In other words, they had a bank account, they had savings, right? We're saving this for when we get to the land, and then we will have flocks, right? And so Yahweh says, okay, I will see your scarcity mentality, and I will raise you food from heaven, right? The manna, food from heaven. But in that scarcity mentality, they would not give an inch. And so when they build the golden calf, when they construct the golden calf and begin to worship it, what does he do? He says, okay, from now on, you will give a tenth of every one of your flock to me. You will give a tenth of everything you own to me, because you're still not getting this abundance mentality versus scarcity mentality. You're not understanding that I am the one who made it to where you could bring your flocks out of Egypt. You're not understanding. And so every time that you sin against my commandments, I want one of your flock, because you're still not getting it, that abundance was not yours to begin with. It's mine. I own 1,000 cattle on 1,000 hills, right? And so the premise is then from that, now we have this idea that tithes and sacrifices are the result of a scarcity mentality, a commandment by God to give of your abundance, or to give of your increase, or to give of whatever it is you have etched out, because you are not willing to accept that it is not yours. Okay. So when I talk about urgency here and importance, if I have even remotely begun to lose you here, then we will have a problem further down. Every single thing that I have given you today has built upon another, and another, because now what we need to ask is, if you are under the commandments of tithing and under the commandments of sacrifice, remember, even Paul was going to sacrifice in the temple in Acts chapter 21. That there needs to be an understanding of that scarcity mentality. The scarcity mentality is a slave mentality. It is, and that is a very unfortunate word to use, because unfortunately us American Christians have a history in the past of the exploitation of humans that we called slaves. It is not the same in an Israelite or in a Hebrew understanding. But what you do need to understand is that when we're talking about the poor, we are talking about economic status. The very fact that the word poor exists means that there are some who are not poor. And if there's some who are not poor, then the word poor exists for them to use to describe the people who do not have what they have. Do you understand that? Does that make sense? That there is a process here in which really what's going on is perception. A poor person just doesn't have what you have. Meaning what? Meaning when we are talking about a weak mind, they're poor because you have a strong mind. If you have a strong mind. And remember, the premise is that that is somehow connected to the idiomatic process of light, right? The movement of photons through space and the perception of those photons with our eyes to see. So in the function of abundance, there is the poor. What do I mean by that? There is no thought process here of abundance without the poor. When you go to this feast day or this feast day or this feast day, you are to ensure that those who are poor are not without during that time. Now, the reason why this is important is because, well, one of the reasons why this is important is because the functional replacements, or I should say dysfunctional replacements for Passover and Tabernacles is Christmas and Easter. And one of the sentiments of Christmas is trying to be goodwill to all, right? So it's interesting what's supposed to be occurring at Sukkot, because that's when the actual birth occurred. What is supposed to be occurring at the Feast of Tabernacles is occurring in the wintertime, and interestingly enough, corresponds with that's when a person who is poor needs the most assistance. There are no fields to glean. There are no really decent ways to dwell within those elements, and death occurs. So I know that you probably think this is about tithing. And I know that as a people who have a tendency to be very tight-fisted, this can be stepping on your toes. But there is a crazy part about this that as of yet, I feel like we have not necessarily encountered. And in its simplicity, it is this. Yeshua says, I was hungry, right? Yeshua says, I was thirsty. Yeshua says, I was in prison. Yeshua says, I was sick. It's interesting how all of this works, because they come to him and they say, when were you actually sick and we visited you? And he says, when you have done it to the least of these, meaning what? The poor are Yeshua. The poor are the Messiah, per se, in the sentiment of when you action upon a poor person, a change in status, right? It's real simple. Think of it from the idea of like, if you have a job that pays you $12 an hour and you get a promotion that causes you to go up to $30 an hour, your economic status just changed. So did your tax bracket. Your economic status just changed. In the same way, if you encounter a person in need, then there is a cross process here that when you give to them, you alter their status, you change their status. But what's interesting about that is what status is being changed. When did abundance come to the people of Israel? After they cried out, after there was a deliverance, and after the armies of Israel delivered themselves from Egypt. Then there was an abundance, but not in mentality, which is why there's a decline in the wilderness season of food, of water, and of protection. Remember, Amalek attacked them. Now, what's interesting is as that's going on, when we give to a poor person and change their status, so they have what? They have a little bucket out in front of them and you throw a $10 bill in there, you just altered their status from 0 to 10. Okay? And so the dynamic is that as you change the status of someone, you are causing them to rise up and elevate, obviously, but also there is a sentiment that you are taking a knee or you are bowing to what? To take hold of them and raise them up. Okay? So in that way, you are what? You are actually altering the status of somebody. So now let's talk a minute about vibrational energy. The vibrational energy of a rock is very undetectable, but is present. If you attach electrodes to a rock, you can detect a very faint wave energy within that rock. Just go pick up a rock out of your driveway. Literally, that's what's going on. Whereas if you were to attach those same electrodes to a blade of grass, you would have a higher vibrational energy, but not as much as if you attach those to an animal, or even better yet, to a human being. In other words, there is a level of vibrational energy present within everything. It's just lower in less sentient forms. I won't say life forms because I don't think you're ready to accept that a rock is alive. Anyways, so the premise is that as we work our way through that thought process, if you were to somehow have the ability to elevate the energy of that rock, and not only that, but had a knowledge and understanding of how to manipulate the covalent and ionic bonds of matter, you could actually have that rock become a blade of grass. If you were to elevate the vibrational energy of a blade of grass in such a way as to also alter its molecular makeup and therefore its materialization, it would become an animal. Again, the same thing is true of an animal to a human being. Now you say, wait a minute, that sounds an awful lot like evolution. Rest assured, everything you believe about creation science is probably not accurate. Let's just go with that. And so now let's go from the point of view of what we're talking about in the sentiment of what we're dealing with a poor person. Let's talk about the idea of social status. When I was homeless, it was painful to be kicked out of the shelter at 7 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter. When I say painful, it wasn't about pride per se. It may have been a little bit like ego. Like, how did I get to this point? Why am I carrying everything I own on my back? But there was an element of like disdain from the shelter if you were there past 7 o'clock. There was this idea that you were scum. Who told you were scum, right? So looking back on that memory, I ask myself, who told me that I was scum? Who told me that I was less? Everything around me, right? I didn't have abundance. I didn't have money. Did I practice the principle of tithing? Oh my gosh, you guys would laugh because I literally, if I found a dime, I'd put a penny in the bell ringer's bucket. If I found $1, then I would put a dime in the bell ringer's bucket. If somebody gave me $100, I'd give $10 to somebody else. When I started getting into the bigger money where I was giving away upwards of $200, I would tell the person, take 20 of that money and get rid of it. Find somebody who needs it. I promise you, they will present themselves. You will attract them to you. But that didn't change the fact that I didn't have the option of just, say, going to a store and buying some food, and when I'm full, throwing away the rest. I didn't have, so things were scarce, right? But what's interesting about all that is that was all in my head in the thought process of discomfort. Why? Because I never was hungry. I never froze to death. There were times where it got a little funky with my fingers when it was cold. But other than that, it wasn't like the world had ended per se in my reality. But there was this belief that I was somehow lesser. Yeshua says, unto the least of these, least of whom? Those who are thirsty, those who are hungry, those who are in prison, those who are sick, right? Those who are cold. I was the least of those. But in that process, I still didn't think in terms of, oh, well, you know what? If something comes to me, I'm not going to tithe it because I can't afford it. Okay. So it's interesting. Then as I became employed and housed, and all of a sudden I was driving around in a BMW and I was running a company and things were great, would I think I can't afford to tithe this month because of bills? I would think in my mind, I can't do this because I I need to make sure that I have money for this, right? Somebody would ask me for help and I would be like, I got these bills, right? Okay. So there is an idea here that it is not a hungry people that goes after other gods. It is not a hungry people who operates in scarcity, even though they're in scarcity. Isn't that crazy? The ebb and flow. So the principle is as I went up in economic status, I began to develop a scarcity mentality, a fear of being poor, right? Whereas when I was poor, there was a ebb and flow in that I had an abundance mentality. There's enough for everybody, right? I will freely and willingly put my 10 cents in a bucket. And all you got to do in that sentiment is add zeros. I will freely and willingly put my $10,000 in the bucket. It's just zeros. 10 cents versus $10,000. Because if you're at that level of economic status and that's your tithe, guess what? Right? But you don't. You say, oh man, I can't afford it, right? Okay. Again, you think this is about tithing, but it's not. I'm about to show you something. So there's this idea that there is this sentiment in the Hebraic understanding of things of honorifics. For example, if you're addressing a king, you call yourself his servant. Or you say if you're talking about your family, you say his servant's father, right? Your servant's father, etc. The honorific is a way of lowering yourself in order to elevate the person, right? That's the premise behind an honorific. Bowing, right, in a process of creating an honorific. But the premise is that there's this idea that when you think about the surrendering of your crown, remember that teaching about the surrendering of the crown as the corporate collective conscience. Remember, the corporate collective conscience is the bride. Remember, the bride corresponds to the 3 feast days, the choosing of the bride, the betrothal, and the consummation, or what we call the kiddushin, the erusin, and the nesusin. The process of the shadchan, the bridal matchmaker, the process of the betrothal between the agreement between the bride and the husband of covenant, and then the process of consummation, all present in the corporate collective conscience. One of the things you need to think about is Passover was the choosing of the bride, and during the choosing of the bride, what do we have? We have that sentiment of preparation before Passover in what? In the feast day of Purim, where we have Esther preparing for an entire year to arrive at the consummation moment. Well, if you start at the consummation moment and cycle back around to the consummation, so the preparation starts here at what? Feast of Tabernacles. Ends at what? The Feast of Tabernacles. What's all the in between? Passover and Pentecost, right? But the premise is as that preparation is occurring, what's happening during the wilderness season? It was to expose her heart, right? The corporate collective conscience heart of scarcity. To expose the corporate collective conscience heart of scarcity. Why is this important? Well, because the sentiment of abundance only exists in a people who are hungry. The hungry person will share with the other hungry person. The process of scarcity is when somebody starts to accumulate abundance, either through hoarding, right? In the sense of maybe one of the poor starts to hoard their stuff and not share it. And then what? They have more than the other poor, which means what? They have a higher economic status. This is simple economic process here, that as economic status change, there is an ebb and flow of abundance mentality. There's enough for everyone versus there's not enough for everyone, and I have to save, I have to retain, I have to maintain, I have to prevent. How many of you has a field right now, whether it be orchards, vineyards, wheat, garden, whatever, and it is inside of a fence? Did you know that's a violation of Torah? Why and how is it a violation of Torah? Because the poor cannot glean. And if you have in your brain, oh, I provide for the poor because I harvest and then I give to the poor. That's not what it says. It says the poor have to be able to glean. Now, obviously, there's a lot that goes into that thought process, but what I'm trying to illustrate for you is that you are trying to contain your abundance. You are afraid that if you allow it to go out, you're afraid that if you allow it to lapse over your budget, as it were, then there is this thought process or this indication that somehow you are going to starve, die in the wilderness. Now, why is this so important? Because when the corporate collective conscience is in a state of scarcity, guess what she's not going to do? She is not going to lay down her crown. How do we know? Because if we accept that the Yeshua is that Christ is the poor, and we accept his divinity as the Son of God, then we accept that God is actually the deficit. Okay? God is actually the lower vibration. You say, well, wait a minute, how's that possible? Well, where do you think vibration comes from? Vibration is just an activation of frequency, which is actually just an ebb and flow of a wave. And here's the interesting part about it, that's all energy. And so when we get into spiritual energy, like vibes, you walk into a room and there's a really good vibe. Have you ever seen somebody walk into a room where there's a really good vibe and kill that vibe? They're vibrating at a lower frequency, and that canceled it out. And so in that sentiment, we have Yeshua being what? The poor. And we are supposed to be a conduit of abundance to the poor. Okay? And so here's the crazy part about it. What do we do when we give to the poor? We bow. And what do we release? Our abundance, our reward of obedience, right? Abundance does not come to the just and unjust. Abundance comes to the child of God, who is what? A child of the promise. Abundance comes to those who are obedient. Read Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14, and you have what? Abundance in all areas. Let me illustrate for you. When we talk about the rainbow, Yahweh promised to the entire world through the rainbow that there would be what? There would be a rain season, there would be a harvest season, there would be a planting season, there would be a dry season, there would be seasons. And those appointed times of God were not going to cease, and they would be cyclical. But in that process, he gave it to everyone, the just and the unjust. And what is the unjust? Somebody who does not have an equal distribution of charity. Remember, a righteous person is somebody who equally distributes charity. They don't show partiality because they want to know where their money's going. They want to say, oh, well, I'm careful who I give to because of this, right? But the premise is in that process, then now we have this idea of that a righteous person gives an equal distribution of charity. So an unrighteous person doesn't give an equal distribution of charity, shows partiality, and has a scarcity mentality, meaning the unrighteous or the wicked will have, as part of their materialization, less economic status. Now, somebody say, oh, wait a minute, what about these wicked rich men? Well, the wealth of the wicked is amassed for the righteous. If there is an amassing of wealth, it is not for them. But I'm just going to point something out to you. No gift. Remember, all good gifts come down from the Father of lights. No gift is actually for you. If you receive a gift, is actually for someone else. Pay attention. You watch, you'll see. It's insane. You will, let's say that you are still a Sunday worshiper sitting in a pew, going out and having pulled pork sandwiches afterwards. And for Christmas, you get a socket set. I guarantee you, sometime during the year, somebody's going to need that socket set. And it will be the abundance mentality that releases it. Now, there are three things that are very, very important about this thought process. If the way in which we are taking a knee, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Christ is Lord, right? If we are taking a knee in order to what? Bless, that's the Hebrew idiom of blessing, is taking a knee. The ancient pictographic Hebrew, the word barak or baruch is taking a knee, kneeling, okay? And so when you bless, you kneel. Why? Because they're of lower economic status. You are standing up, they are sitting down. It's simple. Okay. Now, obviously, that's very metaphorical because you could have somebody very much standing up and you sitting down, and you still transfer that energy, you still transfer that abundance, etc. Now, here's the part that's interesting. If it's true of what I'm saying about the unrighteous not equally distributing their wealth and conditionally distributing their wealth, or worse yet, retaining it and not having that abundance mentality, then the sentiment here also needs to come into the form that that means that they will have a lower vibrational energy. That's a given, right? Which means what? Technically, they are poor, even though they are rich. Okay, so now in all of that process, then as we start to elevate vibrational energy with God giving concern to your social status, this is the crazy part. Read Deuteronomy chapter 28, 1 through 14. That is social status. That is social and economic status. He cares about what others think of you, and he cares about what you think others think of you. Never heard that from the pulpit. Then we understand that this idea of that him caring about the poor person because of the fact that it is a lower social status, then all of a sudden we start to get into what are you doing when you alter that status, and what are you doing when you do not alter that status? Remember, there is kind of a sentiment that inaction equals consent. And if you see a person in need and you don't help them out, and you have the capability of doing it, regardless of your need, right? That's one of the scary parts of this thing is, I don't know how many times, I'll give you an example. I am not currently very economically elite. I have been. I've had that ebb and flow occur, but I can tell you, I know and I remember the stewardships that I did not honor. And I remember the tithes that I did not give in the time when I was on top. I was driving around in my BMW, about to buy a house, having much income. I was not being a good steward of my money. But right now, I don't have it. And the truth is that if I spend anything outside of my budget, I'm juggling a bill. So the other day, I'm at the grocery store, and I am there just to get some window wiper fluid. It's cheaper at the grocery stores. So the principle is that basically I walk up and the self checkouts are all full, and there's lines going to all of the aisles of the checkout clerks. So I was like, okay, well, let's wait here for a minute. And so I'm sitting there, and this dude keeps swiping his card. Beep, beep. And then it will say, please swipe card or, insert cash. And so I'm noticing that he's being declined, right? Now, I don't know how much is actually on my card. I know there was enough to buy the fluid, right? B, I have no idea what his bill actually was. And so I was like, having a problem with your card? Now, this guy looks like maybe working class, doesn't look poor, doesn't look like he's not taking care of his clothes, looked like he was wearing clean clothes, but it looked like he probably worked outside a lot. His hands had, cuts and calluses on them for sure. And he kept swiping the card as if there was going to be something different occur, which is what I thought I had money on this card, right? So then I was like, okay, I knew that I probably didn't have like $100 on there. So I asked him, I said, how much is it? And he says, I don't know. It's probably about, $10, $12. And I was like, okay. Well, so then, I was like, all right, well, let me pay it. And he was like, really? And I was like, yeah, dude, it happens to me all the time. I don't know how many times this stupid reader doesn't read my card. And, and I paid it. I paid it with an understanding that it probably is encroaching upon money that I may or may not have in that account. It is probably encroaching upon some bill that I am about to have to pay. But at that moment, that was the need. Now, was he poor? I don't know. Was he of less economic status than me? I don't know. What I do know is at that moment, for whatever reason, that's what was supposed to happen. The reason I bring this up is because that is the mentality that you need to have when abundance finally comes. When Yahweh says, I am sending you into a city where you will live in houses you did not build, you will eat from vineyards you did not cultivate. He says, when you harvest your vineyard, do not go over it twice, and do not pick up the grapes that fall on the ground. That is for whom? The poor. The poor. And that premise is then defined as the fatherless, right? The widow, right? The sojourner among you. You see, the person dwelling with Israel was not supposed to be elite to Israel. We have people in this country in this day and age who are way more wealthy than the Israelites. The Israelites who dwell in this country, those who have chosen to believe that they are grafted in, those who have chosen to be Torah observant, are not as wealthy as those who sojourn among them. Why? Because there's still stuff going on where we are in the transition from crying out to the Yeshua principle to the death. We still have possession, oppression, and infestation. There is a positional curse with the assembly or church. And that positional curse is a choice to worship God the way the nations worship their gods. I won't get too much into that. But so what we really need to get our minds around then is this idea that a gift is not for you. Now, when we're talking about consumption, you need to understand your belly will never get much bigger than it already is. And when I say that, I don't mean that you won't become fat or gain weight, let's say. What I'm saying is after you're done eating and there's food left over, that food was not ever for you. And it isn't meant for you to stockpile. It is meant for someone else to be eating at that moment with you. And if you get that wisdom understood, then you'll understand that every time you eat, you should have somebody eating with you. Okay? And I am not talking about food. So in that whole process, where I'm going with this is an understanding that the intensification of all power in the universe is your provision so that you can give your abundance to the intensification of all power in the universe. Let's catch that. You can give it right back. And all you've done is consumed what you needed. This is a very different economy, isn't it? But now we see how there is the bowing of the knee and the surrendering of the crown. What is the crown? The crown is the authority or jurisdiction to govern. You're surrendering your crown. You're not going to govern the poor. You're not going to have authority over them. You're going to elevate them to equal status with you. And where do we get the most activity of need for those things? Well, remember the time when I spoke about the fruit of the Spirit? There's a couple things that are very, very important about fruit. The first thing that you need to ask is, where and when do you get fruit? So if I am in the action of sowing, do I have fruit? Am I bearing fruit? No, I'm putting a seed into the ground. Once the seed dies, is resurrected, matures, becomes a tree, then there is fruit, which is the abundance that I now have to equally distribute, which is what makes me righteous. Remember, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. We already have a guarantee of that process of equal distribution if we stop worrying about the merit of it, right? Okay, why is that important? Because one could argue that if you think that it is status oriented that you become an equal distributor of wealth, then you will not distribute. You'll be waiting for that moment when you have just enough. You'll say, oh, you know what? I will actually start tithing when I get back to that, when I get back to that $2,000 a month status. Or I will actually give to those in need after all of my needs are met. That's scarcity mentality. Okay, so the process here of that then falls into that system of elevation. So why did I tell you what I told you about what happened with the grocery store? Well, in its simplicity, it was just the abundance mentality. It was just the belief that some of the money in my account was not my own. It wasn't about tithe. I don't even know if I gave actually a tithe of what I've earned this month. But I do know that at that moment, I changed his economic status. Why? He went from a zero balance on his card to having his groceries. Okay. That then was me what? Taking a knee, surrendering my crown, surrendering my authority to govern him because he is lesser than me. Which means what? There's an element of a need to elevate the lesser to a state of equality. Now, there are dangers to this process because obviously there's always a greater and lesser. And there seems to be a dynamic process between that, right? And if there's a time of equality, there's a reason for it, but it doesn't have to do with authority per se, as much as it has to do with comfort and discomfort. The truth is that you could probably go through a good percentage of your life governing nothing, but elevating it to a state of equality. And there's only a few times in your life or in the process of your marriage, of your raising your children, of whatever, where you actually have to exercise your right as the greater. So Why is this so important? Well, the whole idea here is that we have a tendency to, when we receive something, think that it is our own and hold on to it and not share it. And we have a tendency to have the ego to think that it is ours. I don't know how many times I have tried to counsel people and tell them that is not yours. That is not yours. I have my own possessions, and I can tell you, trying to come to a conclusion that they're not mine is very much an assault to my ego. But what we really need to get our minds wrapped around is anything that comes in. Where do I get that sentimentality? Well, I get it from Job. Interestingly enough, Job, when his wife says, curse God and die, says, you speak as a foolish woman. And shall we not receive from Yahweh both tov ve ra? Shall we not receive from God both good and evil? Okay. I could tell you that sentiment right there, that thought process right there has gotten me kicked out of ministries before. Shall we not receive from God both good and evil? Well, what is God doing giving us evil? Think about the word evil. Remember, it's the twisted rope in the human head, right? It's the wound, it's the twisting, it's the changing, it's the altering, the augmentation of reality in the past that is then triggered and augments the reality of the future and therefore creates the future that the past was. And there's, unfortunately, then a loop. That is the wound, right? So shall we not receive wounds from God? Which means what? That he has sent someone into our lives to what? To injure us. And in that sentiment, then you're like, okay. So what you're saying is what this guy did to me these 20 years ago, it was from God. The affliction that occurred, the wound that occurred within you was your mind twisting and augmenting reality. The actual assault or the actual wound or the actual damage could have been a car accident. The actual damage is done, gone, over with, finished. What you carry is an augmentation of reality at that time period in order for your brain to be able to handle the guilt, the shame, the pain, the discomfort, all of those things is now flipped over and what? Overlaid over your reality now, where you are walking as a victim of that damage 20 some years later. And what are you doing? You are maintaining a scarcity mentality with it. You don't realize that it was a gift. You don't realize that the word gift itself just means to bestow upon another. And so if that is something that occurred in your life, remember, everything happens the way it's supposed to. If that's something that occurred in your life, then it is not yours. And you are not allowed to own it. And here's the part that's crazy about it. You are operating in a scarcity mentality. You are trying to maintain it, to save it, to keep it, when you are supposed to what? Give it away. What do I mean by that? I mean that your adversity is not yours. It's somebody else's. And here's the crazy part about it. What does that mean? That means when you finally let go of that, you'll realize that you've actually been suffering for someone else. You have actually been activated as a Yeshua, as a Messiah, and are suffering for someone else so that when you heal from it, You will meet them and you will show them how to get through it without augmenting their reality. And who knows? Maybe that's the person who was going to blow up a building. Maybe that's the person who was going to kickstart the apocalypse, as it were. What does that mean? That means that just like you won't give to the poor when you should be giving to the poor because you think you need to be at a certain economic status, you won't heal in order to distribute that abundance of healing to others. In other words, your adversity, that augmentation of reality back 20 years ago, is actually for the moment that you overcome it. Remember, the serpent was put in the garden so that Adam wouldn't eat the fruit. Remember that. Remember that the point behind all of that was that Adam would overcome it, and Yeshua finally did. And just through one man, death entered the world. Through one man, so did life. Right? And so that premise is that what was introduced by Adam is then something new is introduced by Yeshua, which is what? Blind obedience, even to death, as a concept, as an idea. So Adam's like, oh, I found out I can be disobedient to God. And everybody's like, oh, he can be disobedient to God, right? Oh, I found out I can actually keep Torah. Oh, he can keep Torah, so could I. Now, granted, we don't. Why? Because our egos tell us that our egos tell us that we actually could do better than God. We do better with God. We can do better than God with our abundance. We can do better with God with our wounds. We can do better than God with our children. We can do better with God with our spouses. We can do better with God with our own soul. That is the flesh. That is the ego. That is the process of that damage, right? Okay, so now getting back to our vibrations, we know that a weak mind is going to hurt you. That's who hurts you, is somebody who has a weak mind and most likely has surrendered to their wounds, right? We know that a strong mind is trying to go and heal people. That is the contrast, right? We know that vibration causes a person to operate as an animal instead of as a human. Why? Because nothing is actually feeding that emptiness present within them. In that process, the way that you have to think about this then is that when somebody operates more in the realm of their wounds or their ego, you can expect three attributes. You can expect that there is going to be what? There is going to be a lower vibration. Second, you can expect what? That they will be of lower economic status than you. They will literally be poor, okay? In some way. Furthermore, you can expect that they will what? So they're vibrating in they're a lower frequency. They have a scarcity mentality. So what? Scarcity mentality, lower economic status, and that may be in energy, and obviously lower vibration. Okay. So lower economic status and vibration may correspond with each other in some aspects, but you can also probably accept that, and this is important, especially if you get into outreach ministry, that the poor are wounded. The poor are wounded. And they may be carrying the wound that you were wounded in, that you were supposed to overcome in order to distribute healing to them. You literally suffered for that person. Okay? This is powerful because now what we have is we have the bride of Yeshua taking a knee, laying down her crown, in order to elevate Yeshua. You got that? That principle, that the elevation that needs to occur. So when we are working with all of this, is it about the fact that I just flat out paid that man's stuff versus me deciding not to pay that man's stuff? Yes, somewhat. Who knows what blessing that is going to bring on me? Who knows? And who knows what blessing that augments because of some scarcity that I reacted to way back when and didn't tithe, now is satisfied. In other words, I don't get anything. Who knows? Who knows how that works? Who knows those dynamics? What we do know is that what you need to do is begin to come into acceptance that nothing you receive is yours. That doesn't mean you can't consume it. Okay? Anybody who rents a home could understand this. Anybody who rents a home, what do we have going on in a rental? It's not your home. Do you live in it? Do you have a refrigerator and you put food in that refrigerator? Do you sleep in a bedroom and in a bed? But that is not your home. You could call it your home. It is the place where you dwell. And there are people who go to their grave renting. And so, is it your home? Yes. Is it really? No. What I want you to understand is that you can consume what you receive. You can consume your wounds and you can consume your abundance. But after that, it is meant for somebody else in some way. Your wound is meant for somebody else in some way. So what is the depth here? The depth is that your mind was not twisted for your sake. Your mind was twisted so that you would become a strong mind. And that strong mind is not for your sake either. You know, if there's one thing that I have learned, what I have gleaned, you know, I often, when I'm counseling people, I tell this story of this man who basically got tired of himself, got tired of being who he was, and decided that he wanted to change, and found that the conventional ways of change were ridiculous. They were stupid. And so he began studying more mystical ways of change. And as he began to step into those mystical ways, he became proficient in that mysticism. And as he became proficient in that mysticism, even his teachers were in awe of how much he had learned so quickly, at which point he starts to become this guru. Well, there's a point in time where he realizes that he's got family, he's got friends, he's got all these people who think the way he used to think. And he realizes that he wants to help him. So he goes to him, he says, hey, you could change, here's how. And they're like, yeah, no, we'll pass, thank you. And so he's like, okay, fine, then I'll just go learn all this knowledge myself. And he goes up and he's a guru on the mountain. And every now and then somebody comes up and asks him some questions. But in the end, he has all this enlightenment and all this wonderful information. And he realizes it doesn't do him any good. He's going to die and nobody's going to know it. And so he goes back down the mountain. He goes to the wounded. And what does he do? He doesn't tell them how to change. He shows them his change. And as he shows them his change, they ask certain questions here and there, absolutely ignorant compared to him. And just the littlest bit of information he shares with them, they walk away just going, right? But the premise is that knowledge, information is not for you. You are not learning this right now. Remember, I have said this. I said this last year at this time, and I said it the year before at this time. I am training my replacements. You will do what I'm doing right now. I don't know how. I don't know if it'll be a YouTube channel or whatever, but there will be a point in time where you begin to teach the things that I'm teaching. When that time comes, I will go my way, my authority, my power, my my notoriety, whatever you want to call it, will diminish and yours will go up, yours will raise. And as it does, you will affect more than I ever could. But if I kept it all to myself, which is what I tried to do, I mean, that was the whole idea. Corporate America, uh, you know, driving around in the BMW and having the status and all that stuff was my way of doing this, what I'm talking to you now about, on my own, alone, without anybody's judgment, without some naysayer over here saying, oh man, you just stepped on 20 different Christian toes. Just me doing my own thing. Now, stepping into the spotlight, stepping in front of a camera, giving this information, sharing with you decades of pain, decades of healing, decades of change, in hope that you would also then be able to change. There is a sentiment amongst teachers. They say you can either learn from your mess or you can learn from a mentor. One way or another, you're going to learn these things. One way or another, we will eventually get out of this loop of this rapture-induced stupor in which we're all waiting to die or be swept away, and actually start living our lives, start healing people, start changing people's economic status. And in the end, our wounds will be the healing that occurs in others. That is going to require you to receive it. What does that mean? That means you go back 20 years and you say, okay, this was a gift, and I need to now figure out how to distribute this gift. I know there's a kind of, sounds like there's a sickness there, right? But the principle is that you can either live in that, stay stuck in that, and I promise you, if you do, you're going to hurt other people. Or you could become the change that this world needs. You can heal from your wounds. You can start distributing your wealth, because just more is going to come. The law of reciprocation is going to guarantee that you will not be destitute as a result of giving away your money. In fact, I think it's either Warren Buffett or maybe it was a Napoleon Hill. I can't remember which one. But one of those two actually gives away his entire income. Yeah, he still consumes. The man still lives like better than Trump, and Trump has a golden toilet seat in his plane. So what, right? I mean, I am not telling you you can't consume. I'm not telling you that you can't enjoy your life. That's the whole point behind abundance, is to enjoy it. Yahweh says for these feasts behind me, he says, go there and buy alcohol and buy meat and buy bread and enjoy yourself. Enjoy yourself on my ticket, because I'm the one that gave it to you in the first place. All I ask is that you make sure that this guy enjoys himself too. Elevate him, raise him up. But if you're too busy being stingy with the gifts you've been given, including your wounds, you're not the change that this world needs. You're the problem. And not only are you the problem, but what you're probably doing as a result of being the problem is saying, I'll change when this person changes, and it's everybody else's fault. When the truth is, it's absolutely you. Okay. So that's all of your idiosyncrasies. That's all of your little boundaries. Oh, don't say this. Don't let them do this. Don't talk that way. Don't act that way. Don't say this about this thing. Right? That is all wounds. But when everybody's allowed to actually speak their mind, when everybody's allowed to do what they would like to do, and it's not some offense to you, believe you me, those who do things they like to do that are outside the realm of Torah still have a reciprocation coming. Let God do what God does. Let him deal with them. It is not your job. It is not your job to go throw blood on people. It is not your job to go hold up a sign that says God hates you. It is your job to let God do his thing, but it is also your job to become the change that this world needs. Because I'm willing to bet if we go into Proverbs chapter 6, you probably fit the criteria in one of those 7 things that are an abomination to God. Why do I bring this up? Because the sentiment is that the problem is outside of here. The problem is him or her or them. No, problem's here. This is what needs repair. This is what needs to change. This is what needs to become an equal distributor. We already have the title available if we will take it. But becoming it means that you have to step into an equal distribution. I can almost guarantee you that your adversity is what your ministry will be. Your adversity is what your ministry will be. If you have gone through some sort of hell, get ready, because what you're going to do is go pull people out of the fire who are going through that hell. You're going to pull the people out of the loop they're stuck in, the loop that you broke out of. Okay? So, what is the key here when we have this going on behind us, this ebb and flow? That there's a way in which this was all supposed to occur. Let's go back to something really quick. I just want to remind you of something here. Remember, I'm just going to go really big green here. Remember all of this where there's and actually I didn't circle enough of it. I could actually circle more of it. Let's go here, right? All of that right there. Is that supposed to be? Is that what Israel is supposed to be doing? Is that what they're supposed to be going through? No. They started with an invitation to what? To make a New Year's resolution for Janus, right? In January. Then what? That same nation that offered them to come and worship the other god now are coming along and saying, hey, you know what? You need to pay a tax. You know what? You need to pay for our protection. If we're going to be an ally with you, you should pay. Oh, you know what? By the way, we actually don't want you to have any blacksmiths in your land because you might be able to make weapons. And the truth is that if you attack us, then, that we won't be allies anymore. You will what? You will make bricks with straw that you go and collect. I own you. You are under my jurisdiction. And who's really getting the jurisdiction? Is all that supposed to occur? No. What is supposed to happen? When the maturation occurs, what is supposed to happen? You are supposed to receive the betrothal. At that betrothal, you will what then? The husband will what? Go and prepare a place for you while you wait in obedience and operate in authority and in the power of spiritual energy as an elite spiritual super powerhouse, possessing the nations, oppressing the wicked, and providing invitation to Torah. That's what's supposed to occur. That's what's supposed to occur. So, the alternative is all that red and yellow and pink, okay? Forget the green. All of that junk right there is your wounds and your abundance mentality or your scarcity mentality and your fear and doubt about who and what you really are. And I promise you, they're just going to stomp all over you. Or You can step into this thought process of a strong mind, and of true eyes to see, right? You can step into this process of going outside the tent and taming the nations. And if you're going to tame the nations, you sure better not have their cultural values, practices, and traditions integrated into your worship of God. Don't go worship Christ on the 25th of December because that's when he was born, which is hogwash. We can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt he was born at Sukkot. With scripture. But this I can tell you, if you will step into that, you will become the elite. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 1 through verse 68, because 1 through 14 tells you what happens if you step into that obedience. What is the amazing thing? He says in Deuteronomy, he says, you will go into cities that you did not build and live in houses you did not construct, and you will eat from vineyards you did not cultivate, from orchards you did not plant, and from fields you did not plant. Meaning what? Meaning you will receive abundance that is not yours. But now watch this. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, I believe it's verse, I want to say verse 16, maybe it's probably 17, I'm not for sure. It literally says, you will build a house and somebody else will live in it. Your wife will grind somebody else's grain. You will plant a vineyard and you will never eat from its grapes. Somebody else will eat its grapes. You literally will become the opposite of abundance. Deuteronomy 28 is powerful, but you need to factor in, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, because the only way in which you're able to be obedient and therefore reap the benefits of Deuteronomy 28 is what? The righteous requirements of the law are fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit, Romans 8:4. Which is what? The difference between that divine vibration and that animal vibration and the lack of elevation. Because why? Because no one else is interested in changing. They're not going to elevate you. So you have to somewhere along the lines just decide to start elevating people. And that will then what? Elevate you through what? Through reciprocation. You'll reap what you're sowing. Getting back to my tree really quick. Remember, there is this premise that you plant a seed, the tree matures, right? There's that maturation. The tree matures and then bears fruit, which is what? You reaping the abundance of what you planted, right? You reap what you sow, but sowing is not fruit. Reaping is fruit, right? What does that mean? That means when it says you'll know them by their fruits, when it says a bad tree can't bear good fruit, when it says a good tree can't bear bad fruit, it is talking about what your abundance would be. It is talking about what your reward or your reciprocation will be. In other words, you want to see if a person is actually doing what they're supposed to do. Watch what happens with their scarcity mentality and their wounds. You want to see whether they're actually sowing seeds, whether they're doing what they're supposed to do. Watch and see what the fruit of their sowing is. Okay? So when it says a bad tree can't bear fruit, good fruit, what you need to think about is that fruit is not the action that you're doing at that moment. Why is it important? Because it says that the fruit of the Spirit is this. What does that mean? Well, it's interesting because why would you need patience, right? Now we have the Christians who say, oh, don't pray for patience because you'll have an opportunity to be patient. Okay, let's think about this differently. Who is the one who needs you to be patient with them? Does the strong mind need you to be patient with them? Probably not. Why? Because they are actually being patient as well. Remember, Yeshua didn't come for the healthy. He came for the sick. What does that mean? That means that part of being the change that this world needs means that you distribute your wealth, you distribute your healing, you distribute those things and don't retain them and don't try to maintain them or save them for a later date. Don't say, oh, yeah, my father did this when I was 4 years old, and expect anything less than you're going to harm someone. Don't expect anything less. And not only that, don't expect to get out of this rut you're in financially, spiritually, physically, emotionally. Don't expect it. Because the truth is that the deficits, the empty vessels that need the inception, that need the seed planting inside them so that something good can grow in them, are the ones that need it. The empty vessels, the deficits, where there is a lack of patience, where there is joy missing. You walk into a room full of bad vibes and you're like, oh, I got to leave. When you don't realize you're the only elite one in that room. You are the only one that can actually elevate everything else around you. You don't realize that. You go into a thrift store or go into something like that, and you see some weird idol on the wall, and immediately you're like, oh God, we got to get out of this place. And you don't realize you are so much more than that stupid statue. And that was not the point behind God's commandments. You walk into a situation and you see abuse of substances, you see abuse of people, and all in your mind, you're thinking, oh, bad vibe, bad vibe, bad vibe, right? Oh, let me get away from this. This is triggering me. I'm not okay right now. I can't handle this. This is too much. When the truth is that's probably why you're there. That's what needs to change. Take a knee, remove your crown, and set it at the feet of that darkness, because that deficit is actually Yeshua. Now, am I saying to worship that? No, I'm saying elevate it. I'm saying take that crown and give it to that poor person. And I don't just mean money. Although I can tell you, a lot of you really, really need to get out of your heads about money, or God's just going to take it away from you. In fact, when I talk about important and urgent, what you need to do after Sabbath. Now, I know during Sabbath, we're resting, we're discussing the Torah, we're doing all these things. After Sabbath, what do you need to do tomorrow? You need to figure out who in your circle of influence is the poorest emotionally, physically, financially. And you need to start getting your mind wrapped around that's the person who God put in your life to change this world. Okay? This is not an easy message. I don't want to go to look at that list tomorrow because I know it's going to be some pain in the neck that I can't deal with. We're all human, and I will admit there is a fault to this. There is an imperfection to this that we're all going to have to get through. But as a corporate, collective consciousness, we need to elevate. And the only way in which we can elevate to become what God created that bride to be, we need to individually all come into alignment of that process. Heal from wounds, yes. Distribute abundance, yes. Consume, yes. But it's not time to be going, oh yeah, no, I can't deal with that person. Or it's not time to be going, oh yeah, you know what, I'm not ready for this. Urgent and important, and I don't know why. I don't know why. It is extremely persistent in my brain right now that you let the poor glean in your fields. It is extremely persistent in my brain right now that you let this whole wound thing that you've been walking in with your medications and your hospital stays and your cutting and all those things go. And if you need assistance with that, this ministry is prepared to help you with that. Okay. So, that being said, for those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. But in that process, I need you to understand that this is, if you're watching this later on as a recorded message, which, is just literally just the live stream as a DVR, days from now, that's the day when it is time for you to get your head wrapped around this. Okay. So as I say, Shabbat Shalom, yes, for those of you who are watching live, amen. But if you're watching this next week, nothing's changed. This message is still persistent and urgent and important at the top of your priority list. So figure out what it means for you and try to understand it. And from that point of view, then you will be able to step out of this darkness and into light and operate in that light, operating in the strong mind, not in the wounded mind, operating in the abundance and not in the scarcity. Shabbat Shalom for those.